Well, welcome to a live recording of the Uncommons podcast. I'm Erskine-Smith, and I'm lucky to be joined by, she's actually a constituent, but you will know her as an award-winning journalist and author, Tanya Talaga. And I said to Tanya before, rather than a land acknowledgement, I actually wanted to read a quote from her book, which I think is the right way to start off. But she writes, "Colonization means more than the theft of land, the stealing of children, and the imposition of British colonial rule. The otherness, the separation and segregation from the rest of the non-Indigenous population all worked to steal something else from us, our minds." Now, you were kind to join us years and years ago at the Fox Theatre to talk about Seven Fallen Feathers. You have another book, which we have not discussed, All Our Relations, but this book, The Knowing, is incredibly personal. They're all intense in their own way, and what you're documenting, but this is incredibly personal. You wrote from the legacies of these dual branches of genocide. You're part Polish and part Indigenous, Anishinaabe, and so from the legacies of these dual branches of genocide, one on Turtle Island and one far off in Eastern Europe, comes my knowing. What brought you to write such an incredibly personal account?
Thanks for that question and for having me. And it's really good to see everyone here on a dark and cold Wednesday evening. So this book is actually because of my mom. My mom had been asking me to find her great-grandma for a really long time. I'm embarrassed to say how long. And she always would say to me, you know, "Tanya, you're the journalist in the family. This is what you do. Why are you not doing this one thing I've asked you to do?" Because of course, you know, it's your mother asking. And so, you know, I'm so terrible. Like, you know, I was putting it off. There were some reasons why I was putting it off too, other than it was just my mother asking me, which is a terrible reason. But it was really hard, you know. The why she was asking me, I knew, came from a place of pain. So my mom was raised in the bush on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. And so it's Anempki Waju. It's Robinson Superior Treaty. It's a special place, actually. I always tell people, if they could picture it in their minds in a way, it is where Treaty Number 3 meets Robinson Superior meets Treaty Number 9. And that area is known as the Arctic Watershed. All of the waters on Turtle Island are supposed to flow north. There's dams and they've made them go south, but that's a whole other story. But the pull of the earth is they go north, or the waters flow south to the Great Lakes. So my mom was raised there by her grandmother, Liz. And Liz was Annie, her great-grandma's daughter, right? There's a lot of names, a lot of grandmas. It's all the maternal line of my family that I'm talking about. So my mother's grandma, my mother's great-grandma. And it was a hard childhood for my mom. It wasn't easy for a number of reasons that I get into quite a bit in the book. But it was her uncle who was a Second World War veteran, Hank Bowen, and it was him that had all this information on our family. He had, like, it was a brown filing folder, and it was full of letters that he had written to the Canadian government, to the Ontario government, asking for any information they had on his mom, Liz, or his grandma, Annie. He had maps of Ontario with First Nations communities circled in little, just like a little black pen, and he had circled all of these communities. He had testimonials written by people that lived beside his grandma and his mom that said, yes, they are really Indians. It was this folder that had all this information, but yet it led me nowhere. And when he died in 2011, that folder came to me with my mom in one of her asks of, will you find Annie? And literally she handed me a white plastic bag very ceremoniously with all the family secrets and said, here, this is it, go find her. So that is why I wrote the book.
It's funny though, Uncle Hank, who has this file folder, when I was reading the book and you were describing Uncle Hank, it reminded me of my my late mother-in-law, who had documented everything on actually her husband's side, my late father-in-law's side, but and it was Thomas Simonton came over from 1834 and from Scotland and landed here and walked to Kamalaki, and some people have that archivist in them and the search for truth, but he spent all this time and he did not actually.
Yeah, well, it was really hard too. Like, so he was older. He was my mom's uncle. So my grandma's brother, right? I should have a map here. I swear.
Yeah, we should have a family
I should have a
tree.
big giant family tree, but just keep thinking it's all the maternal side. My mom's, and the children on that side. Okay. So, yeah, he took a long time, but you had to understand it was before the internet that he started. By the time he was in a nursing home in Thunder Bay, the time he was at St. Joe's, he was like not able to go and find things. And you have to keep in mind too that our records are really, really hard to find. We have something called Library Archives Canada that you all know about, and it's supposed to have everything, all the records that we've got, so to speak. But only at that time too, hardly anything was digitized, right? He wasn't using a computer and doing that. You had to go there to Ottawa, right by the Parliament buildings. That's where LAC is. And you had to look through things. And he did. Some of the stuff that I have in that filing folder is taken, like photocopies of information that he was looking for at LAC. I have faxes, remember those? That were sent to Uncle Hank from the Ontario government, for instance. It said, your mother does not exist as a person in this province. When we knew she was a person, she was standing there. He had her, all the way down to me. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So that's why it took so long. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, because a country that is intent on destroying you doesn't really care about your records too much.
Right, and there's an unwillingness to help you pursue that truth. I don't want to spoil the book, but the discovery, you write, every Indigenous family is missing loved ones. And the idea of the knowing is there's a truth that families and communities know, but that is not necessarily a part of an official record and reported properly. But there's that knowing. Who did Annie turn out to be?
Yeah. I'm glad you picked up on that, because that's so important. Every single First Nations family, and it's always important to know that I speak very much from a First Nations perspective, because as you know, there are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Canada. And as First Nations, many of us, like myself, I am something called a status Indian. So the Indian Act, which is an 1876 piece of legislation, it's a race-based piece of legislation, keeps all of people who are deemed status Indians under the eyes of the government on this giant roll, believe it or not. And so we have 10-digit numbers beside our names. And that's the perspective of which I speak, which is very different from Inuit and the Métis perspective. And why was I telling you that?
We're figuring out who Annie is.
Oh, right. So we want to know who Annie is. So, my mom said, find Annie. All we knew was Annie's last name at the time was Gauthier. Annie Gauthier. And how did we know that? Well, she was married to a man that my mother grew up thinking was her great-grandfather. Her mom and her aunts and uncles thought this guy was also their grandfather, but guess what? he totally wasn't related to us, which is something as I did my research, I was suspecting in the back of my head that maybe he wasn't. And so that was her second husband, Annie Gauthier. That meant she had a different name. What was her maiden name? All we had, and all Uncle Hank had in his brown filing folder, was her death certificate. And the death certificate said Anne Gauthier, died at the Ontario Hospital. She was 71, question mark. Her birthplace unknown, her parentage unknown, where she was from unknown. There's lots of unknowns written on this death certificate. And it said that she was buried in something called the Lakeshore Cemetery in New Toronto. And then it also said that she died of gangrene of the intestines. And so I was trying to, you get this, and I'm like, okay, what do I do with this? This is a big, long answer to who is Annie. I have a friend who's a professional archivist. Now, I'm a journalist, I've been a journalist for over 25 years. I find people for a living, but I called my friend, the archivist, always call him librarian. They can find anything, anywhere. And he has a company in Ottawa, and he said to me, if you ever need any help with anything, just give me a call. So I called him and I said, listen, you got to help me find Annie. My mom is like, really wants me to do this. She said she's not getting any younger, and she's not. And so I gave him the death certificate. And within about 5 months, he got back to me and he said, we found her, who she is. We found her in the 1871 census in Albany Fort, Ontario. And Albany Fort is Fort Albany on the James Bay coast. And there she was, listed as not Anne, not Anna. She was an Annie with an I and an E. She had brothers and sisters in 1871. It was 1881 census. So that meant she was born in 1871. She was 10 years old in the census. It said she went to school. It said that her brother James also went to school with her. Census reports are remarkable things, so thank you very much, Government of Canada, for that. Every 10 years, they look at who is in the family, what age you are, and where you are. And that census told us very much about Annie. And it said, too, she was a Cree Indian, and so was her dad, Jean-Baptiste Carpenter, and her mom, Jane. Yeah.
And as you track not just Annie, but then the descendants of Annie, it is a story, it's a personal story of your family, but it's also a story of the injustice of the residential school system.
Yeah, so as I was doing this, Kamloops happened. And when Kamloops happened, I write a column for the Globe and Mail. I got on a plane because I got an email from Rachel Coy, who was at the time working for Cookpee, Roseanne Casimir. Cookpee is chief. And she said, please come out here. So I went out there to tell their story. And I was there for the first week of Kamloops unfolding and the discovery of the 215. The community doesn't like to say that. They prefer to call it Leswewe, which means the missing in Shuswap. So I went out there to write that story, And as I was doing that, I'm getting information, right? And it's sinking into me about Annie. And it's also sinking into me about all the people in our family. If you are, as I said, a First Nations person, you've heard the stories. There's someone that didn't come home from either an Indian residential school, tuberculosis hospital, an Indian hospital. They were just gone. Or the child welfare system. They're just taken, right? It's just a fact. And then when I was at Kamloops and talking to the survivors, and they were telling me we always knew there were people that didn't come home in our class. And one of the survivors, Evelyn, she said to me, We call this the knowing. And as soon as I heard that, I'm like, that's exactly my family. It's every other First Nations family that I know. We're all looking for people that we've lost.
You write about Kamloops specifically, interestingly, about that phrase, the knowing, that surviving children from Kamloops tell stories of being woken up in the middle of the night to dig graves in the apple orchard. You also write, though, about you're there, and it's obviously an incredibly intense moment. There's international media, there's the government's responding, and it's an incredibly political time as much as it is an incredibly emotional time for the community. That you you're right. My head was spinning, but I had one clear thought: we needed Murray Sinclair, and you call and you speak to him, and he says to you, "You are in the eye of the storm now. Be careful." What did he mean?
Well, looking back on that, I knew what he meant. He goes, you're going to be facing a lot of pushback, a lot of people saying it's all bullshit, it's not true, denialism, show me the grave, show me the bodies. I mean, how sick is that?
And yet we've seen that.
And that's exactly what he said. You are going to face the racism, you're going to face the angry emails, the threats, everything else, because he knew what that was like. Murray Sinclair, the late Murray Sinclair, was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. He knew what that was like, to feel hate and that racism. And he's like, they're gonna do it to you too, and everyone else that talks about it.
I've been lucky to have not only Murray Sinclair join me in conversation for the podcast before, but also Kimberly Murray, who was the interlocutor in relation to the unmarked burials and the knowing in a way, but not just a campaign.
Oh, yeah, she's amazing. Yeah.
It's interesting. I don't think it only applies to this, but it certainly applies to that denialism. In confronting it, I think it's a useful way of thinking about how to confront a sense of willful ignorance in other places too, but the three audiences. And this idea that there are people who know and have read and watched and understand. There are people who will never believe. And then there's a much larger segment, and
the mushy middle.
And education is everything, and more knowledge is everything.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So Murray Sinclair used to say this. I don't know if he said this in your podcast too, or if it just he told me. He said, "There's always going to be people out there that believe you. They get it. They understand. And they are allies, and that's wonderful." And then on the other end of the spectrum, way at the other end, you've got people that say, no way, that deny, that say this is absolutely not true. So they're the haters. But in the middle, there's all these people, just kind of regular Canadians that say, yeah, I saw one of those schools at the edge of my town where I grew up, but I just didn't really know what happened there. Or I'd like to learn more about it, but I don't really know. So those are the people he told me that he wrote the TRC for. That's the mushy middle. He wrote, and if you ever get a chance to read it, you must read all the volumes of the TRC. I know I'm saying that, but it's beautifully written. It is an incredible historical account, true historical account of what happened in this country. And it's put together by Murray, the commissioners, and a whole bunch of other people, academics, Anne Lindsay, who actually helped me quite a bit in my own book. And it's remarkable. Please read it. And that's where the mushy middle comes from.
So I like the encouragement, and I like how it was framed. The idea of the TRC was to arm the reasonable with information and facts. I will tell you, though, I think when you think about knowledge dissemination overall, I think everyone plays a role along the spectrum. I don't think everyone's going to read the TRC reporting as far as it goes, and it can be quite intense and dense and heavy, and it reads for a librarian in some ways more than it reads for your average Canadian.
Perspective. I love
But
that. Yeah.
but there are people like you who then take those very same lessons and then make it incredibly accessible. And that's sort of what you're doing here.
If you do read the TRC, if you open to the second page and the copyright is right there. And it actually says that we made these books for you to copy. Take the ideas in here
Exactly.
and take them forward. That was the whole point of it. And so thank you for saying that. The TRC and what the commissioners did is very much a backbone and has been for all my writing, to be honest with you. But I see the stories, I see in our communities, I see the parallels and the stories that come from there.
We've talked about your family. You also, though, go to some lengths to document some, not all, some of Canada's villains. And many will know Duncan Campbell Scott, although I didn't know, I knew sort of
That he signed
remove the Indian from the child, that bit, but I didn't know, you were quoting at some length from an article he'd written in 1906 that was just properly awful. But you even go, I knew Emily Murphy, one of the famous five. I knew her racism towards Black people in the context of the prohibition and abstinence advocacy.
Yeah.
I didn't fully appreciate that she was equally awful. And you wrote clear that her suffragette ideals were meant only for white people. And then you got George Simpson for the, you document a number of.
I know.
Of
Every time I walk by that famous 5 statue, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Because Emily Murphy was a total racist. She thought that all Indigenous women were slow, and she, along with Nellie McClung, believed in eugenics, sterilizing our women. Every time I see that statue, that's all I can think of. It's like, who do we tell history, and what is the truth? Canada hasn't looked at the truth in a fulsome way.
And someone like Emily Murphy has a mixed legacy. Someone like George Simpson, there's no mixed legacy there.
Oh yes, he's my favorite villain, I think, out of all of them.
Well, who is George Simpson?
Well, I know. Okay, and this is going to be like a bit of a shameless plug too I started Substack. I just got on Substack. I just started like my first post today, and I wrote about Sir George Simpson because there was an article. I was up early. I was supposed to be writing my new book, but of course I wasn't. I was up early reading the Toronto Star, and there was a story in the Star about the HBC Hudson Bay Company's art going up for sale today at a Yorkville auction house. And so I thought to myself, oh, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if there's any First Nations art in there and or maps, because the HBC also had a lot of our maps that were made by our people, and they had other things that were ours. And so I thought, is that going to be in there? Big, long story to tell you who sort of George Simpson is. They mentioned in the Star article about, you can go, like they mentioned all the 27 pieces that were up for auction, and they were all the celebrating the glories of colonization and the oppression of Indigenous people. Like, it was hilarious. And the one was this giant picture painting of Sir George Simpson. And I just went, Urgh. So who was he? So he lorded over the Hudson Bay Company for 40 years. He was the governor of the HBC. Now, the HBC, Hudson Bay Company, basically won out in a duel against the Northwest Company and all these other competing fur trading companies to take over something called Rupert's Land. So from 1670 until 1870, 200 years older than the country of Canada, there was this fur trading empire run by governors from London, all British or Scottish or, UK businessmen. It was like a family compact. Many of the folks, they were all interwoven. Their families intermarried. They worked for The HBC, these governors, so they were kind of like the CEOs at the time. They worked for the East India Trading Company, and they also worked for the African National Company. And the African National Company, they owned the slave trade. And those governors were also governors of the HBC. If you don't believe me, you can actually go on the City of London's website, London, UK, and you can pump in the early governors of the HBC, and you'll see all this information that comes up. It's just quite extraordinary. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, right, this is why Canada has an Indian Act. This is why there's the othering of our people. This is why we have Indian residential schools, right? Where are these ideals of Canada from? From these guys. So Sir George Simpson, he, for 40 years, was the governor of the HBC, and he was a Scot. He reportedly traveled with bagpipes behind him. He had multiple wives, like multiple Indigenous wives. And I say Indigenous because he was also, he was with Métis women from the Red River area as well. And he would impregnate them and discard them, try and sort of get rid of them onto other people or whatever. And when he decided it was time to marry, he went back to Scotland and married his cousin. Brought her back to Winnipeg, what became Winnipeg area. And there's a classic anecdote, she is walking through the streets of Winnipeg one day, and a little boy ran up to her, and she's like, oh, this little boy looks kind of familiar, but he was an Indigenous kid. And she asked, what's your name? And he said, George Simpson. Yeah. So, and anyway, and every history book that I've read, or not every, but some of the history books I've read, they say that he was absolute, I see there's children here, so I shouldn't swear again, but he was an absolute jerk.
Yeah, I think you
and a racist.
A monster is sort of how you...
Yes, and that. Yeah. I know, so these are the paintings that are on sale for the HBC that you can go, right in time for the holidays.
And speaking of monsters, I mean, so the bit from Scribner's Magazine, this is from Duncan Campbell Scott. Speaking about Indigenous people, he says, it is still evident that he is but a slave, used by all traders alike as a tool to provide wealth and therefore to be kept in good condition as cheaply as possible. And when you walk by that famous 5 statue, I get where you're coming from. Insofar as the line from Emily Murphy that I'd written down, but there were others, was, this question is solving itself. A few years hence, there will be no Indians. Now, you mentioned truth-telling. And I was struck, I got to be honest. So there's a lot of truth-telling in the book, and a lot of people are sharing. You are sharing a very personal story. If you speak to anyone who was involved in the TRC process, there was a lot. There were thousands of people who were coming forward and telling their stories, and yet you've got a quote from your mom who says, "Some things I will never tell you, I will take to my grave." Mm-hmm. And how have you found in not only your figuring out your personal lineage, but also covering Indigenous issues that you have in such a way over so many years, that tension between the importance of truth and truth-telling, but also these deeply personal and tragic and horrifying stories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of survivors that don't want to share everything, right? And I know in my own family, and I see it in other First Nations families too, some people that just don't want to talk, right? And a lot of our families, sometimes there's a lot of silence. No one talks about what happened then, what happened at the schools, or what happened to their grandparents or their cousins, or like you just don't talk about it sometimes. And that is the silence that we always lived with in my family. You just didn't go there. And I know other families are exactly that same way.
And yet, you also write, if every First Nations, Métis, and Inuit family told their story, we would rewrite the truth about Canada.
True.
And so it just becomes this...
but it doesn't have to be that part, right?
It doesn't have to be that.
You don't have to, and it's up to every survivor and intergenerational survivor to say what they want to say and what they don't want to say. Some things are personal, and some things you don't have to, like the phrase trauma porn, right? You don't have to do that to sell books or movies or anything like that.
Or to understand.
You can just tell the facts
Yeah.
as to, what happened. I mean, facts like children were taken away. They were plucked from fields in BC, just outside of Kamloops, put on the back of cattle cars. Children, like in my own family, were taken away from Annie. Christina was her daughter, and she was forced transferred over to the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border and sent to an Indian residential school there. This happened constantly. These are the facts. We're not making this up.
And I've been at enough events where the standard line tends to be truth comes before reconciliation. Well, there's plenty of truth. You documented plenty of truth. You also write about reconciliation, and it is. I say this as a politician, but you didn't have the most positive words for politicians in that I think you are rightly expressing frustration at. I think you talk about catchphrases, and politicians are almost going through the motions. We have seen progress, imperfect as it is, and yet, and I would say over the last 10 years, probably more progress, unquestionably more progress on reconciliation than we've seen at any other point in this country's history. Where do you see us at today when it comes to that question of progress?
Thanks for that question. And I'll say two things to that. There are politicians that really mean well, right? That your heart is in it and you really want to do things, you want to change. But there is this giant bureaucratic system behind things like the Department of Indian Affairs. And sorry, we're always going to call it that. There are tens of thousands of people that work for these departments too, right? I mean, so there's a giant bureaucracy that is resistant to change. It's like turning around the Titanic with a lot of these bureaucracies and agencies. And so that is actually a big, huge problem. Okay, so let's park that over there. But you can be well-meaning and everything else up here, but then you got that mushy middle again. That's actually in a different way, the bureaucracy, right? So you've got that there. And then you have the TRC. Well, it's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action, and they are a roadmap. They are a gift from the survivors on how this country can move forward towards reconciliation. I like to say it's how Canada can mend its spirit. And only 13 out of those 94 calls have been completed. And most of those calls are actually kind of that Canada has done are the low-hanging fruit. September 30th, let's make a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Okay, well, that's one gone. The hard ones, the first several recommendations, calls to action are child welfare and education. Those are the hardest ones to do, and those are the ones that really we're still stalled at. Now, the Liberal government did pass child welfare legislation, which was really amazing, but it was just passed, but there was no teeth behind it. It was like, okay, here, yeah, you can go do that if you want, but the structures were not set up. And First Nations communities often don't have the infrastructure to do child welfare on their own.
Right, there's two parts. There's devolution of authority, but then also
That's right.
Resourcing.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
It struck me, we talk about free audience, it struck me when it comes to reconciliation, you've got okay, political actors, and you talked about over promises and starry-eyed promises at different times.
Which is nice, like we all understood, like when Justin Trudeau promised before he was prime minister, he said, we're going to do all 94 calls to action. Every single First Nations person went, oh, yeah, you are. Everybody knew there was no way. But, we thought, okay, well, maybe. Because if one thing, we're always like hopeful, right? Okay, well, maybe this time it's all going to happen. It's all going to work. And you are right, though, saying that, I mean, we're far more along than our cousins south of the Medicine Line.
Well, and one challenge in politics tends to be you set an expectation here and then you wildly deliver despite best of intentions. It does seem to me, though, everyone's legacy is mixed in its own way. But I do think, and when he was speaking, when Prime Minister Trudeau was speaking in Kamloops, you were quite frustrated, and fairly so, given the debate and discussion and general right frustrations around the lack of documentary disclosure and all of that. I do think, though, when you think of imperfect progress as it is, looking back at those 10 years, but for him putting that as an agenda item and compare that to today, where we have a budget, and it's not to say there's nothing around reconciliation. There's certainly a stronger focus on economic reconciliation, but I do think it's moved down the priority list versus what we saw from Trudeau to a degree, and so child welfare is an example, clean water is an example. We aren't where we need to be, but we've come a long way. Having said that, okay, you've got politicians, you've got. I like the line you said. One thing is certain, in large measure, even now, amid all of their talk of reconciliation, governments and institutions are not always willing or forthcoming, so we must do the work ourselves. And so you've got politicians in the one category, and then you've got, you're speaking to the need for Indigenous communities to maintain this real strong sense of accountability to say, you've said you'll do the thing, now do the thing.
Yeah, no, I fully believe that Canadians can't wait for politicians to change laws, for governments, for businesses, for school boards to stand up and say, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. I really believe that every single person needs to do it themselves. We can't wait for change at a legislative level. If we do wait for that, and no offense, we're going to be waiting forever, right? You can, Martin Luther King said you could change all the legislation you want in the world, write all the laws you want in the world, and you can't still make someone sit beside me at a lunch counter. And that's true. It has to be moral imperative. You have to feel like you want to change. You have to feel like you want this country to actually include that every child really does matter. Every kid should have a high school in their community. Every kid should have clean water and a fresh food, a fridge full of nutritious food, not living in moldy houses, having someone that takes them every day, picks them up from school or tucks them in at night and tells them, listen, I love you, you belong, and you're worth it.
And that's, you're getting at that idea of worth, a basic sense of dignity, that idea of equality of concern, respect, that everyone is that basic.
Yes. I mean, like, it should not matter.
Yes.
I mean, but due to the history of colonization in this country, we've set this country up where there are two tiers of citizens. There are non-Indigenous Canadians, and then there are First Nations people, right? And you can see it through our history, the Indian Act, Indian hospitals, child welfare, Indian residential schools and day schools.
And that gets at the necessary, important category of allyship. And you speak of Ed and Jeffrey in this book. Who are Ed and Jeffrey?
Okay. So Ed Januszewski, he is the man that took care of Annie's grave. So Okay, if you've read the book, you know. Because I say right on the very first page of the book where Annie is, and so I'm about to spoil it for you.
It's okay if you spoil the first page, you know.
Okay, so I'm going to spoil the first page. Annie is in an unmarked grave just off of the Gardner Expressway, south of the giant blue and yellow IKEA. So if you go to Evans and Horner Avenue and you just get off right there, right on your left-hand side, there is, so south of the Gardner, the Queen Elizabeth Way, you will see this, there's a black wrought iron fence around it now, but before there was nothing there. It was a giant garbage dump and a dog run. And that was the graveyard for the Ontario Hospital. So what was the Ontario Hospital? The Ontario Hospital had all these different names, including the Toronto Insane Asylum. It is now, of course, the Center for Addictions and Mental Health. But if you've ever been to Humber College, yeah, by the lakeshore, that is the old Ontario Hospital. And when you look at it, it looks like it probably was some sort of an institution, right? It's been all refurbished. Underneath it, there's a series of tunnels where patients were moved and little secret rooms. The graveyard, there are 1,511 people. Most of them are in unmarked graves there. Yeah, and that's where Annie is.
And Ed and Jeffrey took what was a completely rundown, ignored, undocumented, disrespected, I would say, space.
That's right.
And
That's
lifted
right.
it up.
Yeah. So Ed was the one that found the existence of the grave in the first place. And so he went to tell his bosses, say, hey, do you know there's a grave here? And they're like, no, we didn't know that. And so he went one day, he drove out there, he found the dog run, he found this whole big giant space. And so he contacted Jeffrey Rome from York University, who is a specialist in psychiatric medicine. And he got a little group together. They petitioned the government. They had the provincial government. They had like a little walk. They put out flyers. They basically raised a total ruckus until somebody paid attention, and Laurel Broughton did, who was the MPP for, I think it's Etobicoke Lakeshore. She was a member of the Liberal Party, and she listened to them, helped them find it out, and put a giant iron fence around it, and has kept it up as a cemetery. Of the 1,511 graves, only 10% have headstones or little markers. The rest is all unmarked.
And why I mentioned those two, I mean, you speak about them as what reconciliation in Canada can be as a matter of allyship.
That's right, yeah.
That just it's regular citizens coming together.
That's what I was just talking about, right? At that moral imperative, and everyone sort of taking it upon themselves. Well, I can do better, right? And I can help turn things around.
The book is intense and is quite heavy reading at times, but I was saying to you earlier, I definitely found myself completely laughing, and partly because it's this moment of levity in and amongst material that otherwise there's no levity at all. But you are with your mom and you're with your daughter, and visiting the after your mom has said, find Annie for me, and you found her, and you're taking her to the gravesite for the first time. And who's
Ed is there,
and who's Arthur Miller?
I know. So Ed is there, and Ed, like, it was a super emotional time for my family. My daughter's with us, my mom's with us. My mom is crying the whole way there. We get there and we go to see her grave. Annie's where she's laying. So Ed takes us. And we walk down through the cemetery. He takes us to the stone, like there's like letters And he takes her to the letter where she takes us to the letter where she is, and then he gets his measuring tape out and he says, "Okay," because he has this giant. He found in the archives all the plots and the numbers listed, and all the names. And so he takes us to where he said Annie is. And then we're there. It's so emotional. I've brought tobacco with me. I've got a smudge kit. I'm starting to smudge the site. And my mom is crying. My daughter's holding her. And I could see Ed at the side of my vision, just kind of standing around looking super awkward. And I'm like, "Oh, this is weird." And then he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, Tanya. Excuse me. Excuse me." And I'm like, "Yes, Ed." And he's like, "This is the wrong person. It's Arthur Miller." So I think it's really funny that we were just like, smudging and laying down traditional medicines for a random white guy that died there named Arthur Miller. And so we felt like, so
You did find
we
it
said
eventually.
goodbye to Arthur. Yeah, and then we found Annie. And then, yeah, so that's kind of how it goes.
And despite all of the tragedy, and obviously it's not just a personal story, it is the story of Canada.
Yeah.
And despite the injustice and the tragedy, you describe it as, I think in positive terms by the end, that it's a story of reclamation and outlasting. What do you mean by that?
I mean that for our families. I mean that for our people. We have been here since well before this country. We will be here for a very, very long time. And I also do believe that, no one's sending anybody back, right? It's like we have to figure out a way to live together, how to make this project of Canada a better place. We can do it. We can get to that point where every child does matter. It's not a catchphrase. That's why I write. I believe that every single child, no matter what color you are, should get that start in life. And I think Canada wants that too. So I know one day we're going to get together and make it happen.
With that, really thank you for your time. Thank you for
thank you.
writing the knowing, and I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us.
Thank you, bye.